Hi, I'm Julia Hartley-Brewer and I've got some very exciting news for you. I'm going to be joining the brilliant, the wonderful Brendan O'Neill for an extra special live recording of his podcast, and you can be there too. It's at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, the 15th of April. We'll be live on Zoom talking about the mess that Britain is in, what we can do about it, and everything else in between. The event is exclusive for Spike supporters, so if you're already a member, just grab your free ticket right now from the Supporters Hub. For all the info you need, including how to become a supporter, if you're not one already, just go to spike-online.com/events. Can't wait to see you there.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Fiona McAnena. Fiona, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brendan.
It's great to have you back on. Listeners will remember we had you on last year, I think, where you talked about the excellent work that you guys do at Sex Matters in terms of standing up for women's rights against the worst aspects of the trans ideology, and also the work that you've previously done with Fair Play for Women, especially in relation to sport. So there's a lot to talk about on this issue still. It's ongoing. It sadly has not disappeared yet. And I have to start off by asking you about this Ultimate Pool Women's Pro Series final, because it is one example where one of these issues that you talk about a lot and you write about a lot has actually hit the headlines, which is that there was this pool final. Pool might not be the foremost sport in people's minds, but it's important to a lot of people out there. There was a women's pool final that had no women in it. So could you just explain to us a little bit about what happened there?
Yes. So Ultimate Pool Group runs pro tours. That means cash prizes. And it means that they sign up players who were then restricted. They're pro players. They're not allowed to go and play for other people. So if you join the Ultimate Pool Tour, it really matters to you that it would be fair. You have a chance to win. You have a chance to win money. A player called Harriet Haynes has been winning a lot of prize money in Ultimate Pool Group events for the last few years. In fact, Haynes has won close to £27,000 in the last 5 years or so, we think, just playing pool. And isn't that nice when you get to do your sport and you actually get paid to do it rather than it costing you money? So Ultimate Pool, the latest in their series, just started. This event last week was, I think, the first of the kind of spring series. And they ended up with 2 male players in the final because the trans-identifying players, Harriet Haynes and Lucy Smith, each defeated 4 women along the way to get to the final. So it's kind of inevitable. If you let people bring male advantage into a women's tournament, that advantage is going to rise to the top. I mean, whether they win or lose doesn't make it fair. I would still say they don't belong, even if they were hopeless. But the fact is they don't have to be brilliant because they bring all that advantage. And there was an outcry and people said, this is ridiculous. It's a shame, really, that it takes something so dramatic before people realize that it's all gone wrong, because all those other women were beaten along the way, and there are other women who've dropped out because they know it's so unfair. So each of these trans players affects many, many women. But there we have the inevitable result of letting them choose to play in the women's category, 2 men in the women's final.
Yeah, it really did capture how serious this is. I think you're completely right that, if it had been 1 man in the final or 1 man in the competition at any stage, it would have been, in my view, unfair and just wrong. If women want to organise their own events, they should be perfectly at liberty to do so without men being involved. But this case really did show, as you suggest, the end result of allowing men into women's sports. The end result is that you can have a final in which there are no women, and yet it's referred to as a women's final. And we even had people like Piers Morgan coming out and saying, this is preposterous. He called it cheating bullshit, which I'm sure is a sentiment a lot of people will share. What do you think this case tells us about what's going on? And do you think it's going to pique a few more people who will now realise that this is actually a serious problem when men are involved in women's sports?
I think the reactions to this show the usual polarization, where on the one hand you have people saying this is so patently unfair, it isn't right. And yes, it definitely piques more people who finally see that you can't just be kind. You can't just indulge the feelings of a few Men that they perceive, I think, to be perhaps fragile, perhaps, in need of a bit of indulgence. And so they say, right, that's it. It's gone too far. It's not right. But on the other side, I think there are the people who say, who cares about pool? It's only a few women. It's not even a proper sport. They're pretty insulting in order to disparage those who are objecting. And in fact, we saw something not quite as strong as that, but in the case that's in court this week that we'll talk about, where this player, Harriet Haynes, is bringing a lawsuit against another pool organisation because they would not let him play in the women's event. The barrister representing Harriet Haynes said, well, tennis is obviously a sex-affected sport. You can see that, but pool, not really. And of course, he's wrong.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that specifically, actually, and then I want to ask you about what's going on with the court cases in relation to this, because that's serious and will have an impact on women's lives. But in relation to that point where, tennis, people can clearly see that tennis is a sport in which if you put a huge hulking bloke up against a woman, that most reasonable people would consider that would be very, very unfair. But then people say, well, pool is just, you stand at a table, you use a stick, you hit a ball. It's not exactly a strength sport. What is your view on that? I mean, what examples would you give of how there is male advantage, even in a sport like that? But then also, the point I keep thinking is, does it even matter if men have an advantage? Which I have no doubt that they do, even in pool. But even there, you just think to yourself, surely if we believe in freedom of association and sexual equality, that women should be free to organise their own events regardless of that advantage. But unpack that for us a little bit.
Yes. Let me just park the tennis question by saying at the world level, the international level, men can still play in women's tennis if they identify as women. And here in the UK, the LTA only just changed its rules, and only for inter-club competition, and clubs themselves are encouraged to let men self-identify as women for their own club tournaments, club championships. So, we say it's blindingly obvious that tennis is sex affected, and it is. But even in that sport, women don't have fairness in most cases. So let's just put that to one side and focus on pool. The first thing to say is that all of these organizations, Ultimate Pool Group, who ran the last weekend's event, all these organizations, they run men's and women's tournaments. And that is universal recognition that that's a useful and legitimate thing to do. And whether that's because of physiological differences or because of past social lack of opportunity on the part of women, they couldn't go into pool halls, really. It's much harder to go into a pub and pick up a game of pool if you're a 17 or 18-year-old girl than if you're a young man. But for whatever reason, there is universal acceptance that women need their own pool. And no one is arguing that that shouldn't be. But let's talk about the physical differences, because actually there are significant differences. So men are, we all know, on average, bigger and stronger than women. And just because you don't get out of breath, it doesn't mean there's no male advantage. I think that's the mistake that counsel for Haynes made in court this week. Greater strength means that you can hit the break shot harder. And it also means that you can hit harder and not lose as much accuracy. Because when you throw or hit, the harder you're trying, the closer you are to your maximum power, the less control you have. And of course, cue sports are all about power and control. And sometimes you don't have to hit very hard, but sometimes you do. And so there is a benefit there for men. Of course, men are also able to reach further, so they're less likely to be having to hit a really power shot. They have more stability leaning over the table because they're not stretching so far, bigger arms, bigger hands holding the cue, so many things. And the proof of that is it's all there to see on the statistics. So, for example, women's games take longer. They just take longer. And that's because it takes the women longer to clear the table. Now, Haynes has argued in court that it's because he practices more and is more skilled, which is pretty insulting, really. Because, does he really think he practices more than any other woman and that's why he's better? But so women's games take longer. Another stat from another precision cue sport, snooker, is quite a good illustration of the difference. So in snooker, a maximum break is when you clear the table in one visit. You score 147. Dozens of men have scored a maximum break, and some players have scored several times. In a world championship the year before last, there were two 147s in the same event. But there's only ever been one woman who has ever, and that's only once, scored a 147. Is that really because she didn't try hard enough, or the other women didn't try hard enough? So, it's really obvious. It doesn't have to be a big difference, and you don't have to get out of breath. It just has to be enough of a difference that on average, men or male bodies have got advantages over female bodies. And size alone tells you that in pool.
Yeah, that could not be clearer. That is very well put, and useful ammunition for anyone who wants to have this discussion about why pool and all sports should be for women only when women want them to play them themselves. I want to ask you about the legal situation here, because it can be a bit complicated for, I guess, outside observers who aren't as involved in this question as you guys are. My understanding is that Harriet Haynes, who you've referred to there, he's the man who identifies as a woman and has been winning lots of these Pro Series pool competitions. He's suing one of the pool organisations that still prevents people like him, i.e. men, from taking part in women's competitions. At the same time, a group of 20 or 30 women, I think, are suing the pools bodies that do allow trans-identifying men to take part, because those women argue, rightly in my view, that it's discriminatory against them if men are allowed to take part. So it seems there's two legal clashes going on. One is a fight for men's right to play in women's sports, and another is a fight for women's right to have their own sports. Could you tell us a bit about what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. So let me just track back 2 years to the point where all these pool organizations, and there are a number of different ones that organize different events, where they all realized that it had been wrong to allow players like Haynes, male players, and he's not the only one, to compete in women's events, because those players, as I mentioned earlier, they were winning a lot of prize money. They were winning a lot of competitions. And so in August 2023, a number of them declared, more or less at the same time, that in future, the women's tours would be only for those born female. So Harriet Haynes then threatened legal action against them all. There were 3 organizations involved. Harriet Haynes threatened legal action against all 3. 2 of them backed down. And in October that year, they reversed that policy. They ditched it, went back to their old policy. And one of them held firm. So the one that held firm and said, no, sorry, you are very welcome to play in our open tour, but you can't play in our women's tour. That one is the one that's in court this week. And Harriet Haynes is claiming discrimination on the grounds that they wouldn't let him play because he's trans. And their argument is, we wouldn't let you play in our amateur tour because you're a professional, because he plays for the Ultimate Pool Group. But in any case, you wouldn't qualify for our women's events ever. But you're welcome. You would be welcome. And any trans player would be welcome in our open events, because anyone can come into those. They don't have to be men, and they can be either very skilled women or men. So that case is going on this week. It's quite revealing hearing the organizers of the pool tournament talk about their process, what went on, because I think it is illustrative of what's going on in a number of sports, Brendan. So they talked about the fact that, they really didn't know kind of what to think about all this. They knew it was difficult and sensitive. They knew you weren't really supposed to talk about it. They said that for years there was a bit of muttering among the players, but nobody really said anything openly. And then it came to a head after some victory by one of these players, male players. And so some of the women complained to the organizers officially and said, this isn't right. And the organizers knew instinctively objectively it wasn't right. And I would say that's the one thing that's never in doubt. People worry a lot about what should we say? What does the law say? How do we talk about this? Are we in danger of offending someone or doing some harm? But they really do know that underlying all that bodies matter in sport. So this organization, the organizers talked on the stand yesterday about the process they went through where they knew people were afraid to speak up. So they set up a sort of anonymous complaints box, really, at the tournament where they said, okay, give us your views. And 15 or 20 comments were received, all saying, look, we've no problem with this player. They should be able to play in the Open, but they really don't belong in the women's event. And after that, the organisers went off and had a look online and tried to figure out what to do and decided that they would have female and Open. So they had to defend yesterday that they had made that decision. And the barrister for Haynes put it to them over and over that it was unreasonable. He said it was unconscionable that they would have created a policy without consulting trans players. But the organisers themselves just said, well, why would we do that? It's our job to make the rules. You know, and one of them said, look, we can't please everybody and we have hundreds of members and someone's always going to be dissatisfied, but I had to do what I thought was right. So it was really, really good to hear them stand up for it. It's the first time I think someone's had to do that in court in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such an interesting case, this whole pool question, and the fact that there are these court cases is so interesting because it shines a light on the Equality Act. And my understanding is that both sides, both the trans side and the women's side are citing the Equality Act in these cases. And I just wanted to ask you what the Equality Act allows for in relation to women's sports, women's freedom of association, the rights of women to organise their own events. And the way I see it is that the Equality Act does allow the banning of so-called trans women in sports where the strength or stamina of one sex might give you an advantage over the opposite sex. So that's how I see the Equality Act. Is that what it says?
That's exactly right. A sport, game or other activity of a competitive nature where the physical strength, stamina or physique of average persons of one sex would give them a disadvantage compared to the other sex. So that's exactly right. So pool is a game and it's the physique and indeed the strength of men that gives them an advantage over women. I think the question of association is a different one. That's the issue of are you allowed to exclude, is a group of lesbians, for example, allowed to meet with while excluding men who say they're women and indeed men who have a piece of paper from the government saying they're women. That will be resolved, we hope, by the Supreme Court very shortly, by the case that For Women Scotland have brought. But the question of sport has always been a separate point in the Equality Act, Section 195. And it's very clear, there's a piece about sex and then there's an additional comment saying that people with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment can also be excluded for the same reason. And that protected characteristic of gender reassignment includes those with gender recognition certificates and those without. It's a very broad category. It's anyone who says they're the other sex, whether or not they have official paper to prove it. So arguably, competitive sport should have been the easiest area for us to defend that women can exclude all men, regardless of identity, from a women's category. But as we know, what happened is that basically 10 years ago, there was some very successful advocacy by those campaigning for trans people to be included on the basis that there wouldn't be many and it really mattered and it didn't really affect anyone, only women. And so undoing that is proving to be a slow and painful process. The law, arguably, in the UK is better than probably anywhere, certainly clearer than the law in the US or Canada. The law in Australia is pretty clear too, but again, people are ignoring it. So this legal case is very important for that reason.
Hi, it's Brendan here. Before we get into this week's episode of The Brendan O'Neill Show, I have some exciting news to share with you. This year, Spiked is celebrating its 25th birthday. 25 years ago, Spiked was a pioneer of online political journalism, and now we are bigger than ever. We're reaching people around the world with our articles, essays, videos, and podcasts, all underpinned by our principled message of freedom, democracy, and progress. This would never have happened without you, our listeners, readers, and supporters. Your donations fund our work, and your enthusiasm spreads the word about it. So as we mark Spike's 25th birthday, we want to say a heartfelt thank you. And we're asking those who can afford it to donate to our anniversary appeal in order to keep Spike going and growing into the future. We also have a very special offer on at the moment. Those who donate £25 or more will get a year's membership to Spike Supporters, our online donor community where you can comment on articles, come to events, and read the site ad-free. This is half of what you'd normally pay for a year's membership. And if you're already a Spike supporter, you can benefit from this offer too. Just make a donation of £25 or more and we'll extend your membership by 12 months. So if you want to support Spiked and get access to some brilliant exclusive perks, go to spiked-online.com/donate. That's spiked-online.com/donate and donate £25 or more to help keep us going for another 25 years. Now, on with the show. Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy that we would need legal cases to establish something that people knew for forever prior to this crazy moment, but that's where we are. It would be remiss of us not to mention Lynn Pinches in relation to this. So she's the pool player who withdrew from an event with Harriet Haynes in 2023, and she did so in quite a protesting fashion. So Lynn made a very clear point that she wasn't going to play against this person because she thought it was unfair. And if you see the clip of this happening, there's lots of cheers for Lynn. There's lots of support for her because pool and snooker and these other sports do strike me as pretty no-nonsense sports. You know, their fan base tend to be pretty sensible working class people who probably don't go along with a lot of this fashionable thinking in relation to the trans ideology. What has her impact been? And I understand that she's involved in the court case with the women. What role has her protest played in kind of bringing this to light?
Yeah, I think it's been very significant. So Lynn is one of a small group who've put their names to the lawsuit that they're bringing against the Ultimate Pool Group and the World 8-Ball Federation. Lynn didn't intend, I think, for that protest to be a big deal when it happened. You know, she's quite a quiet person, and she's finding it very stressful, this whole process, very difficult. She's faced some intimidation when she's gone to pool tournaments. Her son is a very good young player, and she supports him, and she's faced some aggression. The vast majority of people support her, exactly as you say, but it's more people who are associated with the trans players, as you can imagine, who are a little bit less welcoming of Lynn. So it's not just Lynn, in fact, who's forfeited matches. Other players have too. And in fact, one of the claimants, Holly Khan, has actually forfeited a pro place in the Ultimate Pool tournament, the one that the guys played in last weekend. She was invited to play in that, and she said no because she's currently suing them for their rules and because she thinks it's just unfair. And that's giving up the opportunity to win significant money and the pleasure and satisfaction of playing and winning. So Lynn definitely started something. And the great thing about the women who play pool is that they are very connected with one another. They're very supportive of one another. So she's part of a group now where they are, although some names are much more prominent, there's a significant group of people supporting one another. And her brother, actually, her brother Barry Pinches is one of the snooker players who's hit a 147 break. So he knows as well as anybody that, you know, that's not something women can easily do. And he's been vocal as well. And quite a few men in the sport have been vocal. But at the top of the game, they haven't yet they haven't yet settled this. Ultimate Pool put out a statement after all the fuss at the weekend, which must have been quite embarrassing for them when two men contested the women's final. So they put out a statement saying that they hoped soon to be able to clarify their position on this. And I think that's a reference to the ongoing legal process between the women and Ultimate Pool.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that the reason they reversed their policy was because Harriet Haynes had threatened them with legal action. So they knew that they were going to be sued either way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's very useful. I want to ask you about a couple of other recent events. And I want to ask about Stephanie Turner, because she's the female fencer who was disqualified from USA fencing competition in Maryland because she took the knee and refused to fence against a trans woman, a male-bodied person, a man. When I saw that, firstly, it really brought home how much these women have to sacrifice as part of their campaign to have fairness in sport. And you mentioned that there are pool players here, female pool players in the UK, who are sacrificing pretty significant amounts of money in order to take a stand on these problematic rules. And Stephanie Turner forfeited her place in that competition by refusing to fence against a man. It really, I mean, that's another sport, isn't it? Fencing, where you can pretty clearly see that there's going to be a male advantage, especially in terms of reach. But it also brings home that this is a problem in almost all sports, because fencing is not a sport I tend to think about very often. And yet even there, you have this issue. Yeah,
there's been really a huge pressure in a lot of sports to be what they call inclusive. And so they have somewhat, in my view, somewhat naively or perhaps thoughtlessly just embraced that idea that you let people go into the category that matches what they say they feel. But if you've got men's and women's categories in sport, that's about physicality. It's not about feelings. Fencing, thankfully, I will say, in the UK last year, British fencing amended its rules. I mean, it's terrible that they had to change them back. This never should have happened, but it did. But they've changed them back now. So what happened to Stephanie Turner wouldn't happen here in the UK now. But fencing is a pretty physical thing. They really get bruised through that padding. They don't usually get cut, but they do get bruised because it's all about that lunge forward, the explosive power to land a blow. And that's why they have separate men's and women's competitions. And she was very brave. I think it takes considerable courage to do this. It took Lynn some courage, but in the US, it's even harder. And so for Stephanie Turner to take the knee as she did, really was brave. And there's a huge outpouring of support for her. The vast majority of people, when polled, agree that a women's competition should be for those who are female and not for people who say they are. But it's still very hard. She was shown a black card, which is the worst, the most severe punishment in fencing. It says you've been unsportsmanlike, and so it's very tough for her. It's particularly problematic, of course, as we know, because it's such a politically polarized issue in the US, and it really shouldn't be. Everyone has always known. The reason there isn't extensive evidence, scientific evidence, that proves that trans-identifying men don't belong in women's sport is because we've never needed to prove that men don't belong in women's sport.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not something we ever thought we would have to prove, and yet.
No, exactly. There's a good analogy, which is when people say, and a lot of the politicians say this, particularly in the US, we need to see the evidence, we don't know, we need more research. I would say we really don't need more research. We already know. It's a bit like saying, we haven't done a proper evidence-based study of whether parachutes save lives. Because you're not going to chuck a bunch of people out with and without parachutes who lives to tell the tale. We know that we've already divided sport into men and women. And if these pool players, these male pool players, think that they have no advantage, then they shouldn't be arguing for their own access to the women's tournaments. They should be arguing for there to be no women's tournaments, just open tournaments. But that's not the case they're making.
Absolutely. Every now and then you see someone will tweet that photograph of two male swimmers standing next to two female swimmers, and someone will say, this is the difference. And you can just see it with your own eyes. And that's how we used to know these things, because we used to have common sense, but we seem to have lost it at a certain point. The Stephanie Turner thing I thought was extraordinary, because to my mind, that image of her taking the knee, I mean, it really, to my mind, it brought back the memory of the 1968 Olympics in Mexico with the Black Power salute. And this, an image in sport of someone making a protest for something that they consider to be very important and suffering severe consequences for it, as the American saluters did in 1968 as well. What do you think has happened to, what do you think's happened to politics in general? The US, as you say, is very polarized on this. Britain is seems to be working things out, although it's taking longer than it should. What's happened in politics in general, do you think, that so many people are willing to watch this happen? Especially people, I guess, who might consider themselves to be on the left, might consider themselves to be progressive, would even call themselves feminists, I guess. That some of those people can sit back and watch someone like Stephanie Turner be given a black card, or watch pool players be kicked out. What's happened there?
Well, I actually think, though, that's part of the reason. It's not despite the fact that they're progressive and, think that they're good people. It's because of that. It seems to be a kind of extension of positive affirmation, an extension of inclusion to them, to say, we try extra hard for people who need extra help. And if people are underrepresented, then we go out of our way to address the barriers and to see what's gone wrong. And those might be considered to be good, virtuous things to do. But what seems to have happened here is they've combined that with another pretty universal societal undercurrent, which is women can accommodate other people. We're everybody's mother, and women's feelings don't come first, men's feelings come first. And whether people recognize that explicitly or not, that's the implication when they say it's only a few. What's the problem? Let them in. What does it cost you? It costs something, but that is discounted because it's happening to women. And it's implicit in the argument that says, there will only be a few trans players, or they're not winning, or they haven't yet won. Is there a point where there are so many that it matters, or where their winnings start to register? But then it's much harder to take something away at that point. But I think the answer to your question is it's a combination of a kind of focus on minorities and thinking that every minority needs some kind of special consideration. I mean, I would argue that men who identify as women aren't really a minority. They're just some men. And we should tolerate their life choices, but that doesn't mean we have to accommodate them at our own expense. I think it's a combination of that identitarian kind of politics, combined with a kind of unstated expectation that women accommodating some men is a perfectly reasonable, normal thing to do.
Absolutely. I think that is so true. And it also speaks as well, I think, to, I guess it gets to the nub of the question, because if we accept the idea that trans women are women, and I've noticed that slogan seems to be disappearing a little bit. It's certainly not chanted as kind of religiously as it was over the past few years. People seem to be distancing themselves from it to a certain extent. But if, we've been told for the past 10 years or more that trans women are women, and if you question that, you're a bigot. That's the end of the discussion. And the logic of that is that you could have a pool competition that was all men, like from the very first round right through to the final, and we would all have to nod along because all these men claim to be women, and you are compelled as a supposedly decent progressive person to accept that they are indeed, in fact, in reality, women. So isn't, as well as tackling all this stuff that you're describing there and bringing to bear the truth and facts on these discussions, it's also about taking a cudgel, I guess, to that very idea that a man can ever become a woman.
Well, I think if those people really thought trans women were women, they wouldn't be going out on a limb to defend their rights and to make a special case for them and, pleading for them to be accommodated and all of this stuff. I mean, if they really were just women like any other women, we wouldn't be having this conversation, and neither would they. If you have to go out and shout that people are something, it's because they're not that thing. So I think you're right that there's a bit of a drift away from that. And now it's more about rights and human rights, which again is another slightly Weasley way of saying sublimate your own rights, center these people. But I think that we are starting to see the pushback in sport first, because it can be done piece by piece. It doesn't require legislation. And because the just obvious unfairness of it and the danger of it is so clear that it's very hard for people to defend. And we know that trans activists have advised that they should keep their work away from sport because sport is such a difficult area for them. So yeah, once you acknowledge in sport that they're not women, then the whole edifice starts to crumble. I mean, how can they not be women on the hockey pitch, which they're not anymore in the UK, new rules in hockey? How can they be men on the hockey pitch, but then women when they go into the changing room after the game? That's kind of tricky. And in swimming, we're hearing a lot about that in swimming. So the swimming organizations at world level and in the UK have reestablished a proper female category for swimming, as they always should have had. But leisure centres, gym operators for the most part, and some sports bodies themselves still say that you should be inclusive, I'm putting that in scare quotes, when it comes to the changing rooms, which means that he's a man in the swimming pool in the race, but then he's a woman when he goes into the showers. And clearly that's ludicrous. So I do think that the focus on sport can start to break down the kind of universal assertion that, we all have an obligation to indulge other people's identities, because you start to see the harm that it does to other people.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I want to let you know some exciting news. My new book is out now. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization. And it's available right now from Amazon. I'm really proud of this book. It is an unflinching account of how the West failed the moral test of 7th of October 2023, which of course is the day that Hamas and other militants invaded Israel and unleashed barbarism. The book documents in chilling detail how activists, academics, and others in the West ended up making excuses for Hamas's violence, ended up taking the side of the pogromists against the pogrom's victims, and ended up, in the process, turning their backs on the values of civilization. The book is fundamentally a call to arms for Western civilization. It makes the case for restoring Enlightenment values and standing with Israel while it's under attack by radical Islamists. I don't know if an author is allowed to describe his own book as essential reading, but I really do think it's essential reading. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and you can get your copy right now on Amazon. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the reasons that the fight is quite hard in some sports, because I think there's probably a recognition on the part of the trans lobby and its allies that if the spell breaks here, then it breaks everywhere else as well, or it potentially breaks in other sections of society too. The spell being that trans women are women. I like your scare quotes around the word inclusive, because it is such an Orwellian term at the moment. So USA Fencing said that it in response to the Stephanie Turner scandal, it said, we're going to stay inclusive. And you think, what's inclusive about ejecting a woman from her competition because she only wants to compete against other women? That's the literal opposite of inclusion. I did want to ask you about the situation in schools and universities, because it's not an issue I'm particularly clear on. I know there are differences here as well between America and Britain, and of course things are changing in America massively, especially since Donald Trump signed his executive order on men and women's sports. What's the situation with schools and universities? Every now and then I read about a man who identifies as a woman playing on a university team, a women's team, and it just horrifies me every time I read about it. But is the situation there changing? Are the rules clearer there than they are maybe in some of the professional sports?
Well, but by and large, university sports take their rules from the national governing body for their sport. So athletics, swimming, cycling, rowing, those sports, that the proper rules cascade down. But what we see is that often in university sports clubs, because young people think that this is so progressive and it's only old folk who don't understand that the world has changed and sex doesn't matter anymore, they push back against those rules. And so where they have the opportunity, they still sometimes have males in women's sports. So for example, in university rowing, we still hear stories about men in women's boats, and that means they're displacing a woman, and it means they're going into the women's changing rooms, and it means when they go on away to overnight events, they may well be in a women's shared room. And in universities, the women who support that are vocal cheerleaders for it, and the women who are uncomfortable feel that they dare not speak. And so you get a very distorted picture there where there's more and more of that because the people who don't like it feel they can't say anything. Schools, we're still waiting for the government guidance here that was prepared and consulted on under the previous Conservative government on gender questioning children at school, because the problem there is that having allowed children to be socially transitioned, and sometimes other children don't even know the true sex of a classmate, particularly in primary schools where you can dress up a little boy to look like a girl and vice versa. Much more difficult after puberty, obviously. But in schools, you've still got these children who are living in stealth. And so schools really don't know what to do with the children who have been socially transitioned. Those children do feel tremendous stress and anxiety. It's one of the things the Cass review referred to, that children living in stealth as puberty approaches feel enormous stress because they're terrified of being found out. So that is the harm that social transition in early years does, is it puts children into a situation where they're living a lie. They know they're living a lie, and puberty is going to be the big reveal. And that's one of the reasons why there's such hype around, children need access to those drugs. If those children hadn't been lied to that they could change sex or that they were the other sex, they wouldn't ever consider that they needed to hide anything. Puberty wouldn't be any more of a problem for them than it is for any other child. And in fact, we know that puberty generally resolves any confusion and dysphoria. But so in schools, there's still a problem. There are parents fighting to stop children being transitioned against their knowledge. So, some of these secretive things that have happened where a child has said, I'm trans, but my parents don't like it. Let me be trans at school, but don't tell them. And that has happened. And it may well still be happening. It's very fragmented in schools, so it's kind of hard to get a full picture of it. And everyone's terrified. Some social workers see that as a threat to the child. I mean, there are some good social workers who recognize that child deserves better than to be lied to and misled. But I think the answer to your question, it's a very messy, chaotic situation where activist teachers and social workers, activist students in universities are the voices that are heard, because still in our society, it's dangerous, it's risky to be the person who speaks up against this ideology. To be someone like Stephanie Turner in the US or Lynn Pinches here still takes courage, is still risky. And so there are still parents who are worried about what their children are being taught. And there are still many people in universities, in sport and in other areas too, who are uncomfortable with having boundaries just ignored, but they find it very difficult to object.
Yeah, it infuriates me when sometimes you will hear a man who plays in women's sports saying, well, I never hear anyone complaining. And you think, well, that's because, the lobby of which you are a part has spent the past 10 years creating such an extraordinarily stifling climate on this issue, where women very often pay a high cost for speaking out. They can lose their position. They can be harassed online. They could be threatened with violence. I mean, this is what happens to women who speak out. So, yeah, they create a culture of censorship and then pat themselves on the back for it. Okay, looking forward then, Fiona, I wanted to ask you just about the future prospects for women's sports and whether you think we're reaching a turning point. It does sound like positive things have been happening in the UK. Some positive things have been happening in the US as well. It's extraordinary to me that it took someone like Donald Trump to reinstate the right of women in certainly in publicly funded institutions to play their own sports, rather than someone who we might consider more traditionally progressive, but that's the world we live in, I guess. And Seb Coe, the president of World Athletics, recently said that they will introduce cheek swabs and blood spot tests for female athletes in order to make sure that they are female athletes and to preserve what he refers to as the integrity of women's competitions. That seemed like a positive step to me, even though it's basically just going back to rules that existed prior to all this insanity. With all that happening, do you feel optimistic about the recovery of women's sports?
I think Seb Coe really has shown leadership on this, and World Athletics is doing the right thing. I think that there's a risk that some of what Donald Trump has done is performative. So if organizations don't comply, will there be proper follow through and proper consequences? We've not seen it yet. I mean, the Attorney General has threatened to have a go at USA fencing, so that's good, but it shouldn't take that. I mean, as far as we can tell, most American sports federations have not yet adopted fair rules for women. You know, I get the impression Trump's moved on from that issue. So I don't think we can rely on people like him. In the UK, again, I don't think we can rely on our politicians. No one really has shown much courage around this. The Conservatives didn't solve it when they had the power to do so. And Labour are largely ignoring it and saying it's down to sports. So it is people like Sebastian Coe who are showing some leadership. They really ought to be able to take courage from the fact that the opinion polls are so much in their favour. And maybe there will be a tipping point. We have seen quite a number of sports change in the UK, and the UK is leading the way on this. Many more of our sports have restored a protected category for females, even when their World Federation has not. So I'm very thankful for that. And, you know, the world didn't fall in on them when they did that. So far, nobody's been sued, which is what they're unsuccessfully, which is what they're all afraid of. The trouble with a lawsuit, of course, is it's a distraction. It's expensive, you know, even if you win. And again, that comes back to why these pool lawsuits are so important, because if this is resolved for one sport, then it really should remove the last excuse of some of the other sports in the UK not to restore fairness, because they're kind of arguing that they're not sure if it's lawful and would it be discrimination and all of that. They don't care about the discrimination against women. They've got away with that for 10 years. Well, now pool isn't getting away with it. So that may be a prompt. And so, yes, the answer to your question, I am hopeful, particularly for the UK, and particularly with Lord Coe leading the way, and World Aquatics also are doing good things. So the Olympics being in the US is going to be interesting, because that will bring some focus. I think the boxing in Paris was another peaking moment where people were really horrified by that. So I think on sport we'll win. The big job then, though, is to push that through to other walks of life. I to your point from earlier about, you know, why women don't speak up and the risks, that is of course all entirely true. But there is another part, which is a lot of people, particularly women, socialize to just kind of make small adjustments and suck it up, you know, just to accommodate other people. And they perhaps fail to understand that some of these activists and indeed people with trans demands, you give them an inch and they'll take a mile. And that's what's happened. You know, what seems like a reasonable accommodation very quickly becomes absolute entitlement. So we are going to have to fight every piece of this. It seems like the politicians won't lead, and it's certainly the people with the trans identities don't want to give anything up. So I think we'll win in sport, but I think there'll still be a big job to do. For example, in healthcare and in the workplace, making it okay for women to have boundaries again. In the end, it's women primarily who feel the consequences. I mean, we as a human rights charity, we're concerned about protecting everyone's rights. But it is women and children who have suffered more from the consequences of this than anyone else. And arguably, we have less power politically. And so it's a bit of a tougher fight.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very well put. And it brings me on to my final question for you, which is just in relation to that fight and why the fight must go on. Because it seems to me when people talk about a vibe shift, I mean, we all know what they mean. Things seem to be changing. Attitudes seem to be changing. But I often think to myself, well, vibe shifts don't come out of the blue. And in fact, if you look at Britain, what is referred to as Turf Island, I quite like the term Turf Island, I have to say. The work done by women here and by their male allies has been extraordinary. I mean, there's your group, Sex Matters. There are many others as well. Some of these women are left-wing feminists from the 80s and the 90s, and others are a bit more on the right. And there's all sorts of women involved in the activism of so-called Turf Island. But it has had an extraordinary impact, both in relation to the court cases, protests on the streets, making the argument in the public sphere. I mean, it is arguable, isn't it, that it was the activism of those women and that kind of Millicent Fawcett approach of courage calls to courage that brought about some of these changes we're seeing. And I guess it's that really needs to carry on at the moment.
I fully agree with you. I think there is no doubt that were it not for those women, and I'm thinking particularly of women whose activism predated my own, were it not for them and all the thousands of men and women who've joined in since, we would be in the same state as the US, where it would be impossible to speak about this. It would be almost impossible to get any kind of pushback in sport rules, never mind any of the other parts of life. And instead, we're in a position here where it's clearly lawful to express beliefs about sex being real and important and immutable in the workplace. And that was a big step. And we've got sport leaders who have gone against their international federation and reinstated the female category, and who then, some of them, go on to lobby their international federation to try and get change at that level. I mean, that happened in rowing. So I feel that we're a growing force, and some people have paid a high price, and there are still people, in workplaces and in sports who are fearful or who can't speak or who are very compromised. But each court case brings, and each drama, like the weekends of the pool competition, like the events of the competition at the weekend, each court case, each sporting drama brings more people to be aware that there is a problem here. And it is so obviously wrong that if they are fairly new to the issue, they may not realize they're not supposed to say so. And so they come out and say it. And the more of us who come out and say it, the safer it becomes to speak the truth. And I think that's where we are. And as you say, you mentioned Millicent Fawcett, courage calls to courage everywhere. Yeah, I think in the UK, we are leading on some of that. And I think we are winning.
Fiona, thank you very much.
Pleasure.